verhalen worden verteld aan de hand van een paar vragen. Wie, wat, waar, wanneer en waarom. Maar wij beantwoorden de belangrijkste vraag. Whisky?
Ja, lekker. Mijn naam is Lucia en vandaag schenkt Max de whisky in. Max, wat drinken we vandaag?
Nou, wij drinken de English Original Single Malt. Dit is een Engelse whisky, zoals de naam al impliceert, uit Norfolk. En deze whisky heeft een heel bijzonder verhaal, aangezien dit namelijk de oudste distilleerderij in Engeland is. Geopend in 2006.
Nou, dat is nogal... Dat noem ik meestal een jonge distilleerderij.
In Schotland is dat een hele jonge distilleerderij, maar dit is de oudste en de eerste distilleerderij in honderden jaren die dus daar weer geopend is. Dus dit bewijst dat de Engelse whiskymarkt nog zeker nieuw en jong en in de kinderschoentjes staat. Ja. En dit is dus de allereerste whisky-distilleerderij in Engeland.
Zijn er wel eerder distilleerderijen geweest die gesloten zijn?
Ja.
Dat wel?
Ja.
Oké.
Maar daar gaan we dadelijk allemaal meer over hebben.
Ja. Nieuwsgierigheid. Hey, een andere vraag. Waarom heb je mijn buisje zo scheef gestickerd?
Nou, als jij nou thuis het gevoel hebt dat je buisjes scheef gestickerd zijn, nou, dat betekent wel dat je de buisjes hebt. En dat kun je krijgen door het podcastabonnement af te sluiten. Die krijg je op...
Het is niet waar ik heen ging. Maar maak maar even af.
Dus op elementsofwhisky.nl/podcast kun je het podcastabonnement krijgen. En dan krijg je dus deze buisjes met daarin de whiskies waar wij het over hebben. En dan gaan Lucia en ik, terwijl jullie hem inschenken, gaan even discussiëren over waarom die scheef geplakt staat. Ja, dat was een foutje. Het spijt me.
Ja, over het algemeen zijn ze heel mooi gestickerd.
Het spijt me.
Maar
misschien was dit na 1 whisky te veel of zo. Nee,
Germ.
We gaan het hebben over Engelse whiskies vandaag, Lucia.
Ja.
Waarom?
Ja, goede vraag.
Goeie vraag. Vind ik leuk.
Goed antwoord.
Dankjewel. Nee, het is... Engelse whiskies zijn een beetje in opmars aan het maken. Op het moment van opname zijn er in Engeland 33 distilleerderijen.
Dat is niet veel.
Wil je weten hoeveel er in Ierland zijn?
Ja. Wat nou als ik nee had gezegd?
18.
Echt waar?
Op dit moment zijn er in Engeland meer distilleerderijen dan in Ierland. Schotland gaan we niet over hebben, dat zijn er echt te veel.
Maar ja, oké, distilleerderijen. Dus alles wat onder die ene umbrella zit van...
Middleton, dat valt onder één distillerij.
Ja, dat is allemaal één ja, oké, fair. Ja, dan heb je al heel veel merken die wegvallen inderdaad. Omdat
voor de
het
mensen
allemaal
die
in
dit
dezelfde
niet...
distilleerderij zit. Ja, ik moest even schakelen.
In Ierland heb je de Middleton Distillery. Daar komt bijvoorbeeld Jameson. Daar komt Redbreast. Daar komen nog heel veel andere merken komen daar vandaan. En dat zit gewoon in één gebouw. Dus dat telt allemaal als één distilleerderij.
Misschien dat in Engeland ook wel zo is.
Nou, in Engeland heb je dus 9 gebieden.
Ja.
Je hebt North East. Daar zitten 3 distilleerderijen. In Yorkshire en Humber. Daar zitten 3 distilleerderijen. In de East Midlands zitten 2 distilleerderijen. In de East of England zitten 2 distilleerderijen. Waaronder de distillerij waar de English gemaakt wordt. Daar zo meteen meer over. In Londen zitten 2 distilleerderijen. In de South East zitten 6 distilleerderijen. In de South West zitten 6 distilleerderijen. De West Midland heeft er 5. En dan hebben we tenslotte nog de Northwest. Die hebben er 4. Nou, de distilleerderij waar we het over hebben is de St. George's Distillery. En deze is in 2005 zijn ze begonnen met het plannen van de distilleerderij. 2006 zijn ze begonnen met de bouw. En ook in december 2006 hebben ze de eerste 29 vaten gevuld.
Maar St. George?
Ja.
Van Joris en de Draak?
Ja, waarschijnlijk. Want zij hebben heel lang een Engelse vlag gehangen met daarin een ridder en een draak. Oh, dus ik denk inderdaad dat inderdaad van het verhaal van Joris en de Draak. Maar,
oftewel St. George the Dragon Slayer.
Maar ik ga het meteen even opschrijven voor je. En dan gaan we dit namelijk vragen nog. Want deze aflevering is heel bijzonder. Wij hebben namelijk, we gaan dadelijk lekker natuurlijk het over de whisky hebben. Maar we hebben ook nog 2 mensen die we vandaag gaan inbellen. Nou, hoe is dat een beetje in zijn beloop gegaan? Toen de distillerij een half jaar open was, toen is daar master distiller Ian Henderson terechtgekomen. Nu denk jij, wie is Ian Henderson? Want dat weet jij niet, toch?
Nee.
Ian Henderson is een legendarische master distiller van Norfolk.
Oh,
Die is
in dat
vervolgens...
geval, ja, ik weet zeker wie dat is. Ja, heel vaak al van gehoord.
Hij is een legendarische master distiller van Norfolk, is met pensioen gegaan, maar is toen toch overstag
Maar
gegaan.
gewoon niet met pensioen.
Ja, het is wel een terugkomend thema, hè? Mensen in de whisky-industrie die met pensioen gaan, maar gewoon doorwerken, hè?
Ja, precies.
Maar goed, die is dus daar begonnen. Vervolgens is dus David daar aan de slag gegaan en heeft 16 weken lang samen met Ian heeft hij getraind en heeft hij dus daar het distilleren geleerd eigenlijk van Ian. David was een brouwer. Hij komt uit de wijnindustrie en is daarna gaan brouwen. Maar dat laten we dadelijk David allemaal zelf vertellen. En is uiteindelijk dus sinds 2008 is hij dus daar zoals ze het leuk op de website zetten, Chief Whisky Maker.
Oh.
Is hij daar bij St. George's.
Max?
Ja?
Leuk. Gaan we het straks met de heren over hebben?
Ja?
Zullen we eens aan de whisky ruiken?
Klinkt als een
Want
heel goed
ik
plan.
ruik bijzondere dingen.
Ik moet zeggen, ik vind het echt heel tof. Ik vind het wel verrassend.
Vertel.
Ik ruik amandel. Beetje zo'n nootachtig... Ik ga zeggen nootachtig vetje. Snap je wat ik bedoel?
Absoluut niet. Weet je wat ik ruik?
Vertel.
Iets heel scherps. Mijn neus gaat er lekker van openstaan. Hou ik van. Daardoor ruik ik namelijk alle andere dingen nee, dat verzin ik niet ter plekke. Maar ik heb wel het gevoel, ik ruik eraan en ik denk wel echt, poep. Mijn holtes zijn open.
Ja. Terwijl het alcoholpercentage valt eigenlijk reuze mee, hè?
Nee, dus wat...
43%.
Ja, dus wat is dat scherpe randje
Ik denk dat
wat
dit...
ik ruik? Zit het raak?
Het is Joris.
Sorry.
Ja, ik weet niet. Ik snap wat je bedoelt met iets scherps. Maar ik denk dat dat een klein beetje een effect is van het hout.
Oh, dat zou goed kunnen. Wat voor vaten heeft hij gelegen, weet je dat?
Dit zijn bourbonvaten.
Gewoon bourbonvaten.
Ex-bourbonvaten.
Oké.
Ja. Maar we gaan zo meteen dadelijk David gaan we nog vragen stellen over hout. Want daar ben ik wel benieuwd naar inderdaad. Dat hij me eens wat meer gaat vertellen over wat voor waar die zijn vaten vandaan halen. Want ik word langzaam er een beetje moe van dat altijd iedereen roept ja, ex-bourbon. Maar ik wil weten waar die vaten vandaan komen. Dus we gaan hem eens aan het hemd vragen en gaan we kijken waar die... Ik vind qua geur, ik moet zeggen, hij is wat frisser. Hij is wel wat lichter. Dat scherpe wat jij erin hebt, vind ik een beetje van het hout komt dat wel af. Er zitten wat fruittonen in. Die volgens mij...
Er zit flink veel fruit in de smaak.
Oké.
Zo.
Is het een fruitboeket?
Ja. Fruit en noten. En dat scherpe randje.
Ik weet niet precies alles wat ze bij St. George's doen. Ik weet niet alle stappen precies. Ik weet dus, het is heel lastig om te zeggen van hey, dat pepertje, die oemf die erin zit, die komt door whatever. Het kan ook zijn omdat dit dat ons palet nog niet gewend is aan whisky, dus dat die dadelijk dat scherpe zo meteen wegvalt.
Ja.
Allemaal van die redenen kunnen daaraan bijdragen.
Hij is vooral lekker warm, vind ik.
Ja, maar wel fruitig warm.
Ja, fruitig warm.
Fruitig warm, met een klein subtiel houttintje erin.
Ja,
het is
herfstachtig. Snap je wat ik bedoel?
Ja, maar ik zou hem ook in de zomer kunnen drinken.
Ja, maar de geur en de smaak doen me denken aan de herfst.
Ja.
Bij de zomerse whiskies denk ik aan tropisch fruit en dat soort dingen.
Ja.
En dit is meer een beetje appeltjes, zacht, kruidig, een beetje toch wel noten. Meer noten dan kruidig.
Het is misschien heel erg stom, hè?
Ja.
Maar ik vind dit wel echt een Britse whisky. Als ik ga denken over hoe zien wij Britten, hè? En hoe zien we de Britse keuken, en hoe zien we het Britse land en alles, weet je. Engeland vind ik altijd heel ingetogen, net.
Ja.
Althans de façade.
Zoals het heurt. Ja.
En deze whisky vind ik ook, het is heel verfijnd, vind ik. Het is heel delicaat, het is heel correct, het is heel, ik wil niet zeggen 13 in een dozijn. Dat absoluut niet, want het heeft wel echt zijn eigen karakter. Maar het is niet gek. Het is niet funky. Als je gaat pakken bijvoorbeeld een Islay whisky, ja, die zijn extreem. Als je gaat kijken naar wat bijvoorbeeld Scandinavische distilleerderijen aan het doen zijn, wat gek is en noem het allemaal op, vind ik dit juist heel ingetogen en juist dat verfijnde zijn ze echt op aan het zoeken. Dat vind ik gewoon echt heel mooi. Dus het smaakt zoals ik denk dat een Brit zou smaken.
Dat is luguber en ik weet niet of we dat in onze podcast mogen verwerken.
Oké, knip het er wel weer uit. Iets meer over de St. George Distillery.
Ja.
St. George's is de eerste distillery die dus geopend is in 2006. De volgende in het rijtje van jong is de Chase Distillery in 2008. 2008 is die geopend in de West Midlands. En dan heb je nog de Adnams Copper House Distillery in 2010 geopend, ook in East of England. Technisch gezien is er een ouder merk aan Engelse whisky, dus het is niet het oudste merk. Dat is namelijk Hicks en Haley. Die is opgericht in 2003, maar die hebben geen eigen distilleerderij. Ha.
Maar Max,
Ja.
Waarom ken ik geen Engelse whiskies?
Ja.
Je denkt bij whisky, denk je aan Schotland, aan Ierland, aan de Verenigde Staten, ook verschillende landen in Europa, in Azië. Maar aan Engeland denken we eigenlijk niet.
Klopt. Ik denk dat probleem nummer 1 is een klein subtiel tijdverschil. Als we gaan pakken Schotland...
Een uurtijdverschil met Nederland.
Ja, dat is echt een probleem.
Ja, dat is,
Nee.
Ik ben hier om grappig te zijn, toch?
Ja, klopt. Nee, als je gaat kijken naar Schotlands oudste distilleerderij, die is opgericht in 1763. Dat is Glenturret. Dat is dus, die hebben een voorsprong van 243 jaar
Op deze.
Op St. George's. Je kunt stellen dat dit een oneerlijk voordeel is. Waarbij ook nog gezegd wordt dat de Bushmills Distillery nog ouder is. Dus Ierland en Schotland zijn zoveel jaar langer aan het distilleren. We hebben echt een hele rijke geschiedenis. Weet je, waar we het ook in een aflevering over Prohibition over hebben gehad. Hè? Het illegaal importeren van Schotse en Ierse whiskies. Verder inderdaad iets wat een gebeurtenis in de geschiedenis wat heel veel mensen vergeten. Wat gewoon een enorme impact heeft gehad op de whisky-industrie. Vroeger werd er enorm veel cognac gedronken. Totdat er opeens een bladluis was. Die dus ervoor zorgde dat de gehele oogst mislukte. Waardoor er een tekort was aan cognac. En daarom zijn ze dus gaan zoeken naar een alternatief daarvoor. En zijn ze gekomen uiteindelijk bij de whisky. Ik dacht van, dit is wel een tof alternatief. En zo heeft whisky ook weer een enorme boost in populariteit gekregen. Maar ook daar zitten dan ook weer een paar grote jongens achter. Die dan de term Scotch nemen. En de term Scotch gaan marketen als dit is dit is kwaliteit. Scotch staat voor kwaliteit. In
Scotch
Nederland
staat voor Schotse whisky.
Ja, maar in de general public wordt dat ook wel vaak geassocieerd met.
Ja.
En die dingen hebben er wel voor gezorgd dat dus uiteindelijk Schotse whiskies, en hier als we ook gaan kijken hier in Nederland, als je een slijterij naar binnen komt met 4 meter aan whisky, hoeveel daarvan zijn Ierse whiskies? Hoeveel zijn daarvan Amerikaanse whiskies? Hoeveel zijn wereldwhiskies? En hoeveel is Schots? Schots is altijd het meeste. Dus nee, ik zou ook op dit moment geen slijter weten die
Engelse whiskies op de plank heeft staan.
Ja. Terwijl er wel 33 distilleerderijen zijn. Dus er is wel keuze. Apropos,
meer dan in Ierland. Nee.
Meer dan in Ierland. Maar als ik daar nog ga kijken naar bijvoorbeeld de English. Wat zij dus hebben. Ze hebben dus een original. Dat is deze. En dan hebben ze nog een smoky. Dat zijn eigenlijk de twee die hier in Nederland ook goed verkrijgbaar zijn. De smoky is een lightly peated. Maar daar zit ook nog een leuk klein trucje achter. En daar gaan we er straks nog met David over hebben. Maar, dus ze hebben een smoky variant en een normale variant. De reden dat jij weinig Engelse whisky proeft en ziet en whatever, is vooral ook omdat het dus een groot tijdverschil met de Schotse industrie. Maar ook omdat Engelse whisky heel vaak onder het kopje wereldwhisky verdwijnt.
Wereldwhisky gebruiken we eigenlijk voor alles wat niet uit Schotland, Ierland of de Verenigde Staten komt. Pretty much.
Ja, of Nederland. Want wij hebben
het dan? Ja, of Nederland, want we zien...
we zien ons eigen product ook als iets aparts. Maar,
ja, precies. Ja, dus dat is wat wij in Nederland zien als een wereldwhisky. Zijn daar voordelen bij?
Van een Engelse whisky zijn dat?
Ja, voor het productieproces bijvoorbeeld?
In principe, Schotland moet zich houden aan de wetgeving rondom whisky van de EU. Maar de Scotch Whisky Association, de SWA, stelt extra regels. Het verhaal, een whisky moet rijpen in eikenhout,
is Schots.
Is puur Schots.
Ja, dat weet ik.
Dus als je dat al gaat weghalen. Voorbeelden van Engelse experimenten die op dit moment gedaan worden met verschillende soorten hout. Bijvoorbeeld kastanjehout, essenhouten vaten, acacia. Acacia? Acacia?
Ik ken het niet.
En een houtsoort waar ik nog nooit van gehoord heb. Moerbei.
Die ken ik wel.
Ja?
Moerbeiboom. Ja.
Een moerbeiboom.
Ja.
Nog nooit van gehoord. Ook nog nooit gezien volgens mij. En ook verschillende andere soorten sherry, port en cognacvaten die dus niet op eikenhouten vaten hebben gereikt. Dat mogen zij gebruiken. Andere dingen is bijvoorbeeld in Schotland moet een single malt gemaakt worden in een koperen potstil.
Oké.
Dat moet.
Ja.
Engeland hoeft dat niet. Dus Engeland kan bijvoorbeeld een single malt maken in bijvoorbeeld een kalmstil.
Ah, oké. Ik was meer over het stukje koper aan het nadenken.
Ja, goed, stainless steel zou ook nog... Je zou in principe in Engeland een stainless steel pot still kunnen maken. Mm-hmm. Ik weet niet of dat positieve effecten zal hebben. Maar ook niet. Maar wat ook kan, zijn column runs.
En wat zijn column runs?
Column runs is een bepaalde methode van distilleren die heel vaak gebruikt wordt bij brandy, oftewel brandewijn.
Oké.
Dus ja, Engeland heeft iets meer flexibiliteit, omdat ze die regels niet hebben. En dat is wel heel tof.
Nou, omdat ze minder regels hebben dus, waar ze zich aan moeten houden. Ja,
ja, precies.
Maar een whisky moet nog steeds minimaal 3 jaar oud zijn.
Dat moet ook. Minimaal 40%. Mag niks aan toegevoegd worden behalve karamelkleurstof.
Oké.
Ja, dus ook
de basisregels zijn hetzelfde.
Ja, precies. Goed. Ik denk dat het misschien wel leuk is om David in te bellen. En dat ik David eens een paar vraagjes ga stellen.
Ja, sure. Ik ben benieuwd.
Oké. David, thank you for making time to talk about your job at St. George.
No problem.
Can you started out as a brewer at Green King, if I'm not mistaken?
I did. I worked prior to that many years ago. I worked in the wine industry, and then I had a kind of some time away, and then I did other jobs, and then I eventually ended up at Green King, and eventually I became a brewer, and then I came to St. George's very early on after about 6 months. They'd been distilling for about 6 months, and I came in.
Okay.
I've been here ever since, so 14 years.
As a distiller, it's like continuing the job that you do as a brewer. Does it help you? This basic understanding of brewing a beer compared to distilling a whiskey?
Yes, I think so. Over the past few years, we've made some grain whiskies, and one of the grain whiskies we made was definitely based on my brewing experience, and I took different grains and kind of played around and wondered what would happen if we distilled whiskey from it. So yeah, for sure. I mean, you can take that experience and bring it in. You don't want to get rid of the experience of the whiskey industry, but can you innovate? Can you do different things? And can you kind of push the boundaries a little bit? And yeah, you can do that for sure.
I'm really interested in staying true to tradition, because when I listen to interviews with you and with Andrew, you are very keen on the Scottish traditional style of distilling, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think when Andrew and his father set the business up, they wanted very much to create a whiskey distillery. Lots of startups now, for fairly obvious reasons, and I completely get it. They make gin because you can, you can make it in 1 week, you can sell it the next week, it gives you an income. Yes. I think what happened here was when they started it, they wanted to be taken very seriously as whiskey distillers. So the decision was made, we're not going to make gin, we're going to make whiskey. And we can't sell it for 3 years, we can't do anything for 3 years. But actually, we are whiskey distillers, and that's what we do.
That's part of the bargain of beginning a whiskey distillery, I guess.
Absolutely. I think in a sense it served us well. I'm not knocking the other people that have made gin. I think it's fine, and it would be fine to do that. It's just the decision was made here. We're not going to do it. What we're going to do is we're going to make whiskey. We're going to focus on whiskey, and that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to concentrate on, and that's what we want to do the best.
All right. I want to ask you a few things about the process of what makes your whiskey different. But before that, I want to just talk about a little bit about your training, because you've been trained being a distiller from a very talented and well-respected man in the industry.
To be honest, I think Ian learned a bit about brewing from me, and I learned a bit about distilling from him.
Okay.
And then I think you take that and you do different things. There was things he was doing as a distiller, and I said, why on earth are you doing that? And he said, that's what we do in the whiskey industry. And I went, we would never do that as brewers. That's just completely the wrong thing to do. I don't get why you're doing it. And so I was questioning him, and he was questioning me. And I think we had that mutual learning. So we worked together for about 3 or 4 months.
Okay.
I put ideas in his head, and he put ideas in my head. Ultimately, for me, if you're producing a drinks product, be it whiskey, gin, vodka, rum, tequila, whatever, for me, the whole point of it is to produce flavor.
Okay.
the process that you go through to get to flavor is different in all of those things. But ultimately, the process is to produce flavor. And that's the most important thing for me.
And how is this process within like the St. George's distillery? Like, what are like things that you guys do different to create these flavors? Like, what is it? How is it that you tweak everything, like from malting, mashing? Like, how do you tweak things to create your own flavors?
For me, the most important thing is always going to be the cask, the barrel. That's always going to be ultimately the most important thing, because 60 to 70% of your flavor in your final product, if you're making a barrel-aged product, is going to come from that wood. So that's 60 to 70%. So you can influence before, but the main bulk of that flavor is coming from the cask. However, having said that, if you wish to, you can play around with your yeast, fermentation time. You know, you can play around with the cut on the still to produce different spirits. I think all those things combined, you know, you go, this is where I want to take the cut. This is how long I want to ferment. So, you know, for example, we have quite a long fermentation. You know, the big guys now, they're looking at maybe 60-hour fermentations. We're looking at a minimum 3 days.
Oh, wow.
Minimum 3 day and 4 days.
Okay.
You know, so what you're doing at that, the liquid is fermented out. We've got the full fermentation done, but what we're doing by allowing then the wash to sit on the yeast is we're creating other flavors. So in a lot of our whiskies, you tend to get this quite nutty, almondy, marzipan kind of thing. And that nuttiness, for me, comes from allowing the wash to sit on the yeast for a little bit longer. So it's fully fermented out. We're not fermenting anymore. All we're doing is allowing the wash to stay in contact with the yeast, and we're producing additional flavour compounds. And even when we get, funnily enough, I read a couple of reviews of one of our whiskies today, and they both mentioned this kind of nutty, almondy quality coming through. And I'm like, yeah, that's the yeast. We're just letting it sit for a little bit longer. That's what we get. It's a trait of our whiskey. We have quite a fast, warm fermentation as well. Okay. So we're creating lots of esters. So we're creating those really fruity,
tropical
pear drop, banana kind of compounds. So it's fairly warm, fairly rapid, but then we let it sit on the yeast.
Okay. And like, I find it very interesting that someone who comes from like a wine and brewing background says that like wood is like the most important part. But being in England compared to like Scotland, where the law states that it must be like oak casks, in England it doesn't define which wood. It must only be.
It doesn't.
And does this mean like you can use different types of wood, like chestnut? And are these things like where you willing to experiment, or are you like, we want to stay true to like the Scottish style of whiskey making?
We haven't experimented with different woods. Okay. It's actually pretty expensive to experiment with different woods. I know there are distillers that have done this. Okay. In fact, if you look at the big guys, Jameson's have actually done it.
Yes.
I know there's a couple of distilleries based in England that have experimented. I think a couple of people have used chestnut. A couple of people have used, I think, some cherry. It creates different flavors. We haven't done that. It's very expensive to do it, and we're a very small company. Okay. Having said that, I can remember a couple of years ago, before the world went mad, having dinner with Brian Nation, who at the time was the master distiller at Jameson's, who's now moved on and is running a distillery in the US. And Jameson's had done some experiments with chestnut and things. We were having dinner together with as you do in the whiskey industry, and there was a few of us there. And Brian gets these samples out, and there was this chestnut one, and it was amazing. I mean, it was so different and so incredible and so amazing. But I was like, oh my, wow! He said that's like 3 months in the wood.
Oh wow!
And it was so powerful. And at the moment, I don't think we have any plans to. I think we're just playing around with things in a different way. You know, as we've always done, we can play around with wash, we can play around with mash bills, we can play around with bouncing it from different barrels. I think we were one of the first people, I mean, given that we were the first whiskey distillery in England for 100 years,
yes,
we started to use some virgin oak, which no one had done here before, and that makes a big difference. To push it further with different woods, you're going to then have to have bespoke barrels made, and I think it becomes
very expensive,
a little bit difficult and very expensive. Yeah, hugely expensive.
But you currently are using bourbon casks? Virgin oak casks?
Predominantly bourbon, bourbon. So we're using ex-Jim Beam.
Okay.
So probably 95% of what we produce goes into ex-Jim Beam casks.
Okay. That's a significant amount.
Oh, yeah, significant. We do have virgin oak.
Okay.
The virgin oak we have is effectively a Jim Beam cask before they fill it.
Okay.
So what we're doing is using the same char as Jim Beam.
Mm-hmm.
They would put bourbon in it, but we're putting our spirit in it. We're using very high quality sherry cask as well.
Okay.
Not necessarily for initial maturation, but
finishing.
At the moment, I would say finishing is for me, a finish is kind of 3 or 4 months maximum.
Okay.
Bear in mind, it's very warm where we are. So in my head, a finish is 3 to 4 months.
Okay.
But we're taking whiskies and we're putting them into sherry casks and we're leaving it longer than that. So for me, I wouldn't call it a finish. It's almost like a secondary maturation.
Okay.
Because the temperature here is so much warmer. You know, if you compare the temperature where I am, I mean, I'm sitting in the distillery now. I've just come out of the main distilling room. It's actually 35 degrees in the distilling room.
Oh, wow.
So it's pretty warm. The warehouses are pretty warm. So for us, if we do anything here more than sort of 3 to 4 months in a different cask, I personally don't think of it as a finish. I think of it as a secondary maturation.
Okay.
The finishing is just lifting flavour, but here, I mean, I've tasted some stuff recently that we've bounced into very high quality sherry casks, which are stupidly expensive. I drew some samples this week because I wanted to just monitor how it was going, and I was just like, wow. I mean, wow. It's like nothing we've produced before. The liquid was incredible. That's both peated and unpeated, because we make both peated and unpeated whiskey here.
I'm currently enjoying like the smoky version you guys produce. So I'm currently enjoying like pretty much both of them. So I'm having best of both worlds.
I mean, it's effectively the smoky is the sort of sister whiskey to the original. It's the only difference is we don't change anything in the production process between those two whiskies, apart from the fact that we use peat smoked barley for the smoky and we use unpeated for the original. Everything else about that production process is exactly the same. We don't change the cut. We don't change anything else. So, for example, for the peated whiskies, we're taking a high cut on the still as we do for the unpeated ones.
Mm-hmm.
So a very high cut. We're not going deep into the phenols. You know, I don't want to make Lefroy. You know, Lefroy do what they do very well. I don't want to do that. I want to produce something different. And we actually, for me, it was amazing. We have people come here that taste our peated whiskey that say they don't like peated whiskey, and we give them our smoky whiskey, and then they go,
okay,
oh, but I quite like that one.
Yeah.
Because you've still got that sweetness there. You've still got the fruit there. You're not overlaying it with the heavy phenols.
Mm-hmm.
So you're still getting the esters. You're still getting fruits, bananas, pineapples. You're still getting the cask influence, but then you balanced it with the smoke.
Okay.
And I think that's what people like about it.
But you're talking about like having a high cut for the people at home who don't know like how do these cuts work, because it's a very vital part in like distilling.
Yeah, I think so. So what you need to do, you need to remember when you're distilling, every humans perceive as flavor is essentially a chemical compound. We think of vanilla as vanilla. You know, most of us know what vanilla tastes like.
Yes.
But actually, that vanilla is an organic compound.
Okay.
Which is why you can synthesize it if you want to. You know, for example, if you're making a peated whiskey,
mm-hmm.
the phenols that produce what we think of as that smoky
character,
taste, that character,
mm-hmm.
they're very heavy, dense compounds. They have a high molecular weight.
Okay.
So when you're distilling and you're evaporating your compounds off the still, because they're heavier, they take longer to come off. So they're going to come off later in the cut.
Okay.
So when I say we use a high cut, what that means is we're getting the very fruity light compounds.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're then making our peated whiskey, we take some of the smoke. But for me, it's more smoky as opposed to peaty.
Yes.
If we cut deeper, if we ran the still for longer, we'd go much deeper into those denser compounds because they weigh more. They come off later in the distillation run.
Mm-hmm.
So more weight means later runoff, and you can get those heavier compounds.
And with a high cut, you exclude some parts of this?
You exclude some of the heavier compounds. So what you get is what I would describe our peated whiskey as. For me, it's more smoky than peaty, which is why we call it smoky. So you don't get that very heavy, oily, Lafroig kind of thing. You get a fresher smoke. So, and when you first taste it, you almost like when you taste our smoky whiskey, you get the fruit first. Mm-hmm. And you go, oh, this is sweet, this is fruity. And then all of a sudden it goes bang on the palate. It's just like, and then you get the smoke. Yes. And you go, wow, that was a surprise because I wasn't expecting that. And it's still there and it's still quite rich, but it's more subtle and it's more gentle, but it's big. And on the finish,
it's more defined, more subtle indeed, yes.
Yeah, and that just comes from taking the kind of lighter phenols rather than the very heavy ones. Okay. So if I took a later cut, so when I'm running 4 shots, if I ran a longer 4 shot and took a later cut, I'd make a much heavier phenolic whiskey. But we don't want to do that. We want to produce what we want to produce. So I would think, if you compare, which I have, if you compare our new make to Ardbeg new make, Ardbeg is incredibly sweet. And if you taste the new makes together, they're very, very similar. And if you actually taste the finished whiskies, they're not actually dissimilar. You still got that sweetness coming through, whereas Lafroig deliberately take a very late cut on the still. So it's very heavy, it's very cloying. It's what makes Lafroig.
Yes.
It's completely unique, as you know. Whereas something like Ardbeg or Bowmore is much sweeter. It's much lighter in character than Lafroig.
Yes.
I would guess, I don't know, but I've tasted the new make. They're taking a slightly higher cut like we are.
Okay. You were talking about currently in the distilling room, it's like 35 degrees. And this it's not optimal. I can imagine when you're making your cuts. But being in England, is it a very different climate where you guys are compared to, like, for example, because we're comparing it with Lafroig constantly, like being in Scotland on Islay, is it so different where you guys are? Yeah,
it's very different. So Islay and Orkney, they're in the Gulf Stream, in inverted commas, warmer than the mainland of Scotland because they're in the Gulf Stream. But where we are in East Anglia, what tends to happen is the weather systems come in from the west. So we get the weather coming in from across the Atlantic from the US, and the rainfall tends to hit the hills on the west of England. By the time it gets to us, we don't get a massive amount of rainfall. It's one of the warmest places in the UK.
Oh.
It's one of the driest places because the rain has typically fallen before it reaches us. Having said that, in the winter, if we get easterly winds, it's incredibly cold. As you guys know, in the Netherlands, we're getting, if we get an easterly, it's literally coming off Siberia across the North Sea and hitting us. Because there's nothing in the way.
Yes.
So we have incredibly warm, humid weather. In the distillery, we have this little microclimate where it's very humid. So we have this incredibly warm, humid weather in the summer, and we have this incredibly cold weather in the winter. Not every year, but I have measured temperatures here at the distillery where we have been seeing minus 15 in the winter.
Okay.
And we've been seeing plus 30 in the summer. So we've got this 45-degree temperature swing.
And this temperature swing, how does it affect stuff like maturation and angel share? Is it extremely different for you guys?
It's hugely different. We've in the last couple of years we've noticed there's certain areas in the warehouses where if the sun rises in the morning, it hits the side of the warehouse, and that's the hottest part of the warehouse. It stays hot all day. So we're seeing, which really surprised me here, we're seeing that phenomenon that you normally only see in places like Kentucky and India, where we're casking our whiskey, and then we go to empty the cask to do a bottling.
Yes.
And the strength is higher than when we cast it.
That's so cool.
So what's happened is we've evaporated more water than alcohol.
Okay, David, I'm so glad that we have this conversation, and I can talk to you for hours. But there's one thing that I want to ask you. It's a cheeky question, but you were talking about these sherry casks that were really, really amazing. What is it that we need to take note, and which bottles that are coming soon or in perhaps a few years, which bottles should we keep our eyes open for?
So the sherry casks, we may do our first bottling, and we're just monitoring them at the moment. We may do our first bottling maybe in October, November this year, and then definitely next year. There's no question next year. I would say maybe in the first 4 months of next year, we will definitely release one of those. And what we've done is we've got some butts, so we've got some 500 litres.
Yes.
We've got some hogsheads, the 250s, and we've filled a variety of aged whiskies into them. Okay. And we're just monitoring them constantly. And because we're having a warm summer in the UK at the moment, I'm just literally monitoring them all, like monthly. We're just taking samples, we're tasting it, we're looking at it, we're seeing how it's going, and you just then have to go, right, this is the optimum, this is what we're going to do, and this is when we're going to do it. I mean, I have to be honest, a couple of years ago, I really hated sherry mature whiskey. To be honest with you, they were too big, too bold. Yes. Too dry. It just wasn't my style. I understand why people like them, and I'm not, to be honest, a massive fan of peated whiskey. I understand what people like about it. I can make it. I mean, we have. I mean, when we sell our whiskey to independent bottlers as well, and Cadenheads buy it. Really high quality producers. So Cadenheads will take our whiskey. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society take our whiskey. They typically take the peated, which is surprising, very nice. It was surprising to me, I have to say. But when those guys tasted it, they were like, "Yeah, we want the peated. It's amazing," and which is great for us. I mean, if we're going to sell to a third party, we want to be selling to the guys that really understand what they're talking about. Exactly. So for us to get the Cadenhead Scotch Malt Whisky Society it's almost like it's a recognition of what you do, but it was just like, right, okay, you want the peated?
Okay, sure.
You sure you don't want to go to Isla? No, we want yours. It's amazing. So it was quite a strange thing, but it's amazing. I'm not a massive fan of peat. I don't mind it. I'm not a massive fan, but I understand what people like. Yes. I used to like it. I've kind of gone off it a little bit. I'm probably sure I'll come back to it at some point in the future. The sherry, for me, it was like, I just don't get it. But now I'm like, wow. I absolutely love it.
Now you see the true potential of like a sherry cask. Now you can...
I really can. I don't know, probably in the last year that I've really thought, do you know what? I really like these whiskies. It's not... if I was, I'll probably, it's the time of talking to you, it's 6:35 in the UK. I'm probably going to be at work for about another hour and a half till about 8 p.m. It's warm, it's hot here, the sun is still shining, and if I go home, I'm probably not going to want a heavy sherry matured whiskey. If I'm going to have a whiskey tonight, I want light and fruity and zesty and fruity. Yes. Because it doesn't feel right. But actually, I'm now getting to the point where I go, well, I can have two of those, or do I just want one heavy sherry? Yes. And I can just sit there and enjoy it, and it's rich and it's dry, and my two daughters are annoying me, so I'm just going to have a really nice big glass of sherry matured whiskey and forget about them. And, do you know what I mean? Yes. For me, whiskey, as I said at the start of our talk, for me, it's all about flavor. Flavor is the most important thing to me. It's like a chef. They create flavors from food. Yes. And for me, it's about creating flavors from the process and the cask. But our spirit in the cask that we've put it in is just. I know I made it. I know I'm the distiller, and I know it sounds like I'm bigging myself up. But honestly, when we put this stuff out, people are going to go,
now,
wow.
David, I'm so looking forward, and I'm going to try my best to get my hands on a bottle, and we'll raise a glass whenever two girls are nagging again. Then we'll just have a very, very bold glass of sherry influenced English. Thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome.
And we are going back to Lucia because we are talking a little bit more about your whiskey, more about the region where you guys are distilling, and we are going to have a chat with Andrew and see what his thoughts are. So lots to look forward.
That's fantastic. Just say to your listeners on your podcast,
yes, thanks
for listening. Keep on drinking the whiskey. I'm sure it's helping in the pandemic. I didn't mean that. I didn't say that. But the alcohol must do something, even if it just helps us forget the mad world that we live in now. So thanks to you, man, and thanks to your listeners. And if you're ever in the UK, you know where to come.
All right. We'll probably swing by as soon as the world goes back to normal again, and we're going coming by and try some amazing drams you guys put out. David,
pleasure.
Zo, daar zijn we weer.
Nou.
Super vet gesprek toch?
Dat was echt tof.
Nou,
wat leuk dat hij daar de tijd voor maakt.
Ja, dat vond ik wel echt heel leuk.
Ja. Ik vind het echt heel tof dat mensen die... Het is toch een drukke man, neem ik aan.
Ja, tuurlijk. Hij moet een distillerij ook gaan draaiend houden.
Ja, precies. En dat hij dan toch even tijd uit zijn schema, uit zijn schedule neemt.
Om eventjes te bellen en met ons te praten over. Echt heel tof. Ja. We sluiten dadelijk het gesprek af met Andrew. Andrew is de chairman. Ja. En hij is de zoon van de man die de distilleerderij heeft gebouwd. Dus zijn vader heeft een hele mooie distillerie gebouwd. En hij is dat dus nu draaiend aan het houden. En klaar aan het maken voor de toekomst. Mm-hmm. Maar voordat we dat doen, wil ik graag een pleidooi voeren voor Norfolk. Waarom? Ik vind namelijk dat wij massaal als Nederlanders moeten wij naar Norfolk gaan.
Oh God. Ja.
Om daar en de distilleerderij te bezoeken natuurlijk.
Ja.
Maar je gaat niet op vakantie met maar één doel. Dus ik heb nu een paar redenen verzameld waarom wij naar Norfolk moeten gaan. In de hoop ook dat jij zegt, is goed, we gaan erheen. Nou, klaar ervoor?
Ja.
Oké. Het eerste reden om naar Norfolk te gaan. Het wapen van Norfolk is een zeemeerleeuw.
Oké, volgende reden.
Nee, maar...
Goed. Ik hap. Een zeemeerleeuw?
Ja.
Wat?
Dat is een zeemeermin, maar dan in plaats van half vrouw is het een half leeuw en de onderkant is vis.
Oké.
Nou, goed. Is niet de beste reden, moet ik bekennen, maar dan beginnen we ermee.
Ik vind het op zich geen slechte reden.
Een andere goede reden is dat in Norfolk heel veel mooie stranden zijn. Het is een kustgebied met heel veel traditionele Engelse kustdorpjes.
Oh, dat is best wel lekker. En zeker nu met de huidige temperaturen daar.
Ja, is dat zeker niet verkeerd.
Ja.
Nou, het is daar zo mooi voor toeven.
Oh god.
Dat zelfs de Queen er een vakantiehuisje heeft. Die je tevens kunt bezoeken als toeristisch attractiepark. Dan heb ik het nog over...
Gaat ze er ooit op vakantie?
Ja!
Is ze er ooit?
Ja!
Kunnen mensen dan ook op bezoek?
Nee!
Dus ik kan niet langskomen en zien hoe de Queen in de pyjama een kop koffie en een scone naar binnen zit te werken 's ochtends vroeg.
Het is een kop thee, Lucia.
Ja, voor het publiek wel.
Maar zij drinkt ook gewoon cappuccino. Ja, nee, is goed. Ja. Nee, mocht dit nog niet reden genoeg zijn en denk je van nou weet je, ik wil aan één kant, met Max wil ik wel naar de St. George's Distillery gaan. Maar ik heb net dat ene kleine beetje nodig om mij over de streep te trekken.
Oh god.
In Norfolk wordt jaarlijks het slakkenracekampioenschap georganiseerd. Snap je nu? Over de streep?
Ja, ik snap het.
Okay.
Ja.
Nee, dit heeft absoluut niks meer met whisky te maken. Daar ben ik me van bewust.
Dat geeft niet.
Maar ik vind het fantastisch hoe je in een regio waar zoveel geschiedenis, zoveel natuur, zoveel mooie omgevingen zijn. En dat letterlijk op de website van Visit Norfolk in de top 5 van activiteiten die je zou moeten bijwonen, dat de slakkenraces zijn.
Is de Queen in Norfolk? Voor de slakkenrace.
Dat is de slakkenrace. Nee, maar goed. Dames en heren, zonder flauwekul. Ben je dus nog op zoek naar een heel leuk... Ik ben trouwens niet gesponsord door Norfolk. Dat wil ik wel even erbij gezegd hebben. Maar Norfolk, als je luistert, Kan geregeld worden. Stel, jij wilt nog op vakantie en denkt, ja, ik ben al een paar keer in Engeland geweest. Londen heb ik nu wel gezien. Ik wil wat nieuws, ik wil wat spannends, wat exciting. En je kunt het niet vinden, dan is Norfolk altijd nog een optie. Mm-hmm. Maar in plaats van dat we op vakantie gaan naar Norfolk, zullen we gewoon bellen met iemand die er nu zit?
Ik denk dat dat onze enige optie is op dit moment.
Daarom gaan we nu eventjes bellen met de chairman en de zoon van de oprichter St. George's Distillery, Andrew Nelstrop. I'm here sitting, calling right to Norfolk. I'm calling to Andrew. Hello, Andrew. How are you?
Hello. Good, thank you.
You are currently the chairman of St. George's Distillery.
I change my job title weekly, I think. Chairman, CEO, owner, MD, doesn't matter. Depends a bit who I'm talking to. Yes.
But
dog walker, doesn't matter.
Currently it's chairman, at least that's what the email states. But tell us, what is all those job titles? What do they have in common? What is it that you do? What is your job?
I'm not entirely sure sometimes. I think like any owner, we do all the jobs that nobody else wants to do, and just try and make sure that everyone else is doing theirs as efficiently as they can.
Okay.
I can make whiskey, but I haven't done it for probably 10 years, so I'd need to get a notebook out. Mm-hmm. And I'm terrible at selling whiskey, so that's reliant on somebody else. So, yes, we tend to do logistics and accounts, I think, as owners, and put out fires when they occur.
And there's, you are the second generation of chairman within St. George's.
Yes, my father started it. He sadly passed away 7 years ago now.
Oh.
So, hence I am chief in charge these days.
And he built the distillery, and it was the first distillery in 100 years?
Yes, so he had, we won't go into more detail, but my father had always dreamt of opening a whiskey distillery. So in 2005, we applied for permission and everything else. I had a building company at the time, so I actually built the distillery. Okay. So we didn't need to get anyone else involved. My father was always an ideas man, so in practice from day one I ran it.
Okay.
And left the ideas and the innovation and that sort of thing to him, which is, that's the fun part. When you're retired or retiring,
yes.
He wanted to do it because he wanted to make the whiskies he liked, and he was liked sort of spending time in the warehouse sampling things and just coming up with new ideas. He didn't want to spend his retirement worrying about accounts and the boring stuff. So I suppose I have done that since day one, really.
Okay. He was more the innovational person behind the distillery?
I think all through his life he was an ideas person. He did a lot of different. We moved where he lived and where he farmed, and the jobs he did a lot over his life, from farming in Australia and Russia and England, doing all sorts of things. So fantastically full of ideas and enthusiastic. So when he set off to do a whiskey distillery, it was done out of pure passion rather than any real need to have something that he was going to sell, or he didn't need the income. It was just a passion project. That is what sets us apart from others.
What I was thinking, I've talked with David about the distillery, and he said, when you guys started, you set out to be a whiskey distillery, and you didn't produce any gins or any vodkas or anything. You just focused on purely whiskey.
It was a really simple decision. When we very first looked at it and had a chat with Customs and Excise, who are the UK's body that gives out licenses to do this distilling, etc. We had originally planned to do a very small distillery, and it was going to be nothing more than a lovely, tiny whiskey distillery that would provide entertainment for my father in his retirement.
Okay.
But interestingly, unlike the rest of Europe, England at the time had a law that stated the minimum size a distillery could be. So our spirit still has to be 1,800 litres.
Okay.
But actually, if you run that flat out, that's 750,000 bottles a year. And that is a lot bigger than having a toy to play with in your retirement. And absolutely typical of my father, he went, fine, we'll build a proper distillery then. So we did. We built an enormous building, and it's got conference centres and shops. And in fact, David, who you spoke to earlier, he's got a lovely house at one end of the distillery.
Oh, okay.
And it's set in 10 acres, and there's a river running through it. And yeah, very smart. There's warehousing for nearly 10,000 casks on site.
Wow.
So it's a big setup, but I think there are so many different ways you make that decision to open a whiskey distillery. Mm-hmm. But I'm still convinced that he only had one sort of note set down, and that was to make the very finest whiskey. That's it. There was no, we've got to do it in 3 years, or we've got to pay back the money in this amount of time. Mm-hmm. That was the only rule. So there was no talk of gin or vodka or anything else. And so we set off and we bought the very best equipment from Forsyths in Scotland. Mm-hmm. It is all traditional in the way it works, but very modern in the way it keeps heat. We're a very environmentally friendly distillery, I suppose, because of the modern heat exchangers we use and the way we save heat. Mm-hmm. But we have not done anything weird or different in the actual method of distilling.
Okay.
The Scots have been perfecting how to make whiskey for hundreds of years. There wasn't much point trying to reinvent the wheel on that point, on the basis that our stills don't need to make any other product.
Okay.
So that was the reasoning behind it all, and that stayed 15 years later. That is still the only requirement of the distillery, to make the very best whiskey.
And what is, in your opinion, what defines the best whiskey?
Well, now nobody knows that. Yes. I mean, in practice, we can determine to a degree that whether our spirit is right and good enough. Mm-hmm. And I think, as David told you, we make 2 different spirits, peated and unpeated.
Yes.
And then after that, it comes down to cask choice and where you're sourcing your casks, how you're going to use your casks, how you're going to store them, where you're going to store them, the time you're going to put whiskey in a cask. And all of these things are different for every distillery. And one of the most interesting things I've found in my 15 years doing this is the way this conversation always steers, because our northern friends, quite rightly, have spent generations telling the world whiskey needs to be 10 years or older.
Yeah.
And probably they are absolutely right if you've got a distillery in Speyside.
Yeah.
But for the rest of us, it's been quite an interesting learning curve as to what age whiskey is ready for bottling. Mm-hmm. Yes, we knew when we were investigating really early on that you could see a difference in the maturation rates just between Islay and Speyside.
Yeah.
So we knew Norfolk would be different. What we have found extraordinary is how just the position of a cask in a warehouse on the same site can make a difference. And it doesn't make a difference by a month or 2, it can make a difference by a year or more.
Oh, wow.
And so it's really interesting. It's fascinating. And if a cask is high up or low down in the warehouse, can also make a difference. A cask that's high up has more interest on the nose, whereas a cask that's low down has more interest on the palate. You waffle about this subject because there is no answer to your question. What makes a perfect whiskey? In our world, all we can do is dedicate exactly what is needed to ensure that our whiskey is as good as it gets. Biggest thing in that is it cannot be rushed.
Yes.
And that is one of the reasons we have never gone out to investors. We have no bank borrowings, we have no outside investors, and that's been really deliberate. Nobody can go, I want my money back now, because it might be 30 years before we want to sell that whiskey or do that project. And I think that's where we really are set apart from the majority of other distilleries.
Yeah, I find it interesting that a whiskey needs time to develop. This approach gives you time to steer by and learn from everything that you experience. meaning that you don't are depending on investors and stuff. But you seeing like these hotspots in like the warehousing, like are you guys also using this to your advantage? Because I talked with David about, he explained that there were some casks that actually increase in alcohol volume.
Yeah, once again, we're on where in the warehouse. I think not as much as people would expect us to. If you get to the point where you are starting, if you have 4,000 casks in the shed, there aren't enough hours or people in a day to literally start moving casks around and changing their position, etc. So what you tend to do is you put your casks in the shed, and then the vast majority of what we sell are single malt whiskies, and therefore they are a vatting of multiple casks.
Yes.
And so it's David's skill set to be able to take those different casks from different places and blend them together to make the single malt we are trying to achieve. It's a very different skill set to only selling, say, single cask whiskies, where you could take two casks made on the same day, the liquid put in the same oak, left for exactly the same period of time, and be left with two entirely different whiskies by picking them from different parts of the warehouse.
Yeah.
And we do that occasionally with our single cask releases. But of course, the majority of what we do is single malts. So you tend to use the variations in the warehouse and in the cask types to create the vatting we are looking for.
All right, and you were we're talking a lot about casks and cask sourcing, and I've done a little research, and I'm very interested because in a previous interview you said that you enjoyed the rum cask finish really a lot.
I do,
but are slowly steering away and more steering towards the single grain you guys produce.
My own favourite tastes. Yes, on our single malts, rum is still my favourite. We still do a lot of rum cask. But yes, the Norfolk, we have a range called the Norfolk, which at the moment consists of 3 different whiskies. One's called Farmers because it's got 7 different grain types in there.
Okay.
One is called Parched because it is made from torrefied grains, which means baked, malt and rye. So it's a part rye whiskey, part malt whiskey. We can't do 100% rye with our equipment. The grains won't go through the kit. So in practice, there's always a portion of malt in there.
Yes.
I definitely like our grain whiskies. I think they are incredibly different. And they're really good whiskies to share. People aren't expecting it when they get to taste it. So they're a good, interesting talking point. But yeah, I think in practice, I still tend to revert to the rum cask if I'm just having whiskey on my own.
And if we're talking about like some casks or some experiments, like, is there something that you currently are working on with David where you're like, I'm really looking forward to this type of cask or this type of whiskey? Or is there anything that you wish that you could do?
When we go back right to the beginning, we bought every type of cask we could get our hands on.
Okay.
And some have worked and some haven't. Some have taken a lot longer than we expected to mature whiskey. Some have been really surprising. We've had some red wine casks that we bought, but at about year 4, we nearly just poured them all down the drain. We didn't like it at all. But because we had the space, we decided we'll leave them in the shed.
Yes.
And amazingly now, 12 years later, it's fantastic.
Oh, wow.
We have begun to learn that it might not taste as we expect it today. We'll just leave it in the shed. Doesn't matter. Yeah. And in practice, if it ends up staying there for 50 years, it doesn't really matter because someone else can deal with it. It's one of the things I think you discussed with David was the use of non-oak.
Yes.
I have looked into this quite a lot. And it's a difficult subject. One of the joys of oak casks is they exist and they are made by people in reasonable volume. You know, the sherry boys need a certain amount, the bourbon boys need a certain amount. Yes. And there is, to a point, a consistency of product.
Yes.
And a proven point product. Now, anyone can wander off down the road and find a good cooper who will make you a chestnut cask. My problem is, and it doesn't really matter what it costs, my problem is getting it repeated again and again. You know, the joy of whiskey is you produce a product that needs to be consistent over the years. And at the moment, I can't find any way or company that will produce those non-oak casks in an entirely consistent manner.
Okay.
And so there's very little point spending a hell of a lot of money on a single chestnut cask to ensure to get a wonderful product, to then not be able to repeat it. So I have steered away from it, not because I'm anti-change or anything else. It's just at the moment, the industry doesn't exist to make non-oak casks on a regular basis in any reasonable quantity consistently.
Okay.
There you are.
Yeah. That's not a valuable solution. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not against it. I mean, I'd love to try a willow cask and a cherry wood cask and all sorts, just to see what happens. But it would be so disappointing to find one of them work well, but we couldn't actually then go and buy 100 casks.
But in the spirit of your
one
father,
man in his shed.
But in the spirit of your, like, the way your father built the distillery, wouldn't it do honor?
He probably would have had a go. Without a doubt, he would have had a go. Yes. And then when he couldn't get hold of 100 of the one that worked, he would have moved on and done something else.
Yes.
Whereas now that I've got to run it and make sure there's whiskey there for the next generation, I need to ensure whatever we do and do well can be repeated again and again. And therefore, we concentrate on the things we can control.
You were talking about, like, if a cask wouldn't, or like whenever a whiskey doesn't turn out the way you expect it, you can just leave them in the shed for another 50 years and just leave it be for the next generation to make it their problem.
There won't be much left.
No.
I don't think 50 years is probably very ambitious in this part of the world due to our evaporation rates. But yes, we can certainly leave it there for a long time.
But to be honest, is there already a second, like a third generation of chairman who is in the picture? Is there? I'm
not that old, sadly. No, I think I'm going to have to be at work for a very long time. My children are 7 and 5.
Ooh,
so yes. I've got at least another 25 years of doing this before they even look like they want to come and work for me.
All right, no, way too young to think about those kind of things.
Yeah,
but what
exactly.
is if we're just talking about what legacy would you wish to leave for, first of all, like the English whiskey scene, because you pioneered this and you are on the forefront of like this whole revolution of like constantly new English distilleries just springing to life, but also more closer, like in Norfolk and in your town, like what is it that you wish that the distillery would be?
I think there's two questions there. I think firstly, there is work in progress there are 38 whiskey distilleries in England at the moment. Some are making whiskey, some have got mature, a few have got mature whiskey, a lot are making whiskey, and one or two are being built as we speak. We are working hard to bring everybody together, a bit like the Scottish Whisky Association, but I think over the course of the next 12 months, we will have something that we can show the world. And one of the joys of being one of the founders of English whiskey, I suppose, is being involved with that. And everybody has different ideas. And one of the interesting things is if you go to Scotland, because it's the easy one, for example, you find similar things going on in similar regions. Interestingly, England, because we are relatively new, we aren't seeing a consistency in the type of equipment, and we're not seeing a consistency necessarily in the flavor profiles that are being made. But we are all working very hard together to try and get some consistency in the quality of the product being made. We think that is terribly important. So that's coming together nicely. And I think, if nothing else, my father's legacy is already set, because there are now 38 distilleries around him. And so that sort of historic legacy has been formed and done, and that must be if you were alive, I think you'd be terribly proud. The other bit, the closer legacy of what do I leave for family, or what about you do your best, don't you? The deal is that you're meant to leave the company in better health than you found it.
Yes.
But so we shall. At the moment, we're all right.
That's so great.
We'll see what happens in 30 years' time.
And maybe we'll find an old wine cask stuck away in the shed.
Well, I think when I retire,
yes.
I might pay the duty on a few casks and just bring them home. That's the secret. We had a lovely chap who lived in the next village, but he used to have whole casks of Glenfarclas down in his cellar.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And when one ran out, he would go and get another one. And they wouldn't. There was no, There was no being precious about it. He would tap it off into Grolsch bottles, with the flip top.
Yes.
There'd be lemonade bottles again with that similar sort of flip top. So if you pop round for a drink, this stuff would get poured out of anything at all different strengths, but fantastic. I think that's, if anyone has the chance and can afford it, that's what we should all do. We should all have a cask at home that we can just tap off whenever we feel we need another bottle.
To be honest, I imagine that if I would have a cask of whiskey in my kitchen, I would make a lot of friends really quickly. That's the first thing that I imagine happening.
I'd be fine with my rum cask of whiskey. Be very happy. That would do. Perfect. Keep me going.
All right.
Yeah.
Andrew, thank you so much. Are there things that people should know about, the English,
We've got a series of new releases coming out this autumn. Mm-hmm. As David alluded to, at some point there will be a sherry hogshead released, which is fantastic, peated. Oh. We will also have, I think, absolutely delicious a virgin oak cask. Oh. A single malt from virgin oak casks, which is lovely. And we will have a very small and exclusive single cask bottling of an old rye whiskey, which has got a high concentrate of rye. Oh. So all these things are coming this autumn. So and some of them are in very small numbers. So it does pay to get signed up on our website, because you will find out before anyone else. And we do not bombard you with emails. I think we probably send about one a month. So it's well worth being signed up, because these bottlings come and go very quickly. But hopefully your listeners will get a chance to try some of them.
If you want to get information sent to you once a month, something like that, you can go to englishwhiskey.co.uk to sign up. So that's the website where people can visit. I'm looking forward to try the sherry cask, because if you are so enthusiastic about it, and David and everyone I talked about with is so excited about it, it is something that we here in the Netherlands should try.
That'll be good. The easiest way to get some is get on a plane from Schiphol and come in to Norwich, and then you're only 25 minutes. It's a 35-minute flight and you're 20-minute drive, and you're here. Easy.
We had a whole segment in the whole podcast about how easy it is, why you should visit Norfolk and visit this distillery. And now you gave him even the travel isn't a difficulty or a hazard.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
Andrew, we're looking forward to visiting you, and really thank you so much for having a chat with us and talking about the great things you guys are doing currently.
Lovely. Cheers, Max. Thank you very much.
Zo. Dat was hem. En fantastisch hoe Andrew over de distillery praat. Over hoe die over de legacy van zijn pa en van hem praat. En ik vind het zo ontzettend gaaf.
Gepassioneerd.
Hij is echt ontzettend gepassioneerd erover. Dat vind ik echt heel mooi om dat te horen. Nou, dames en heren. Dit was de aflevering alweer. En vertel eens, Lucia. Waar hebben we het allemaal vandaag over gehad?
Oh, zoveel. We hebben het gehad over Engeland. Over de 33 distilleerderijen die zij daar hebben. Maar specifiek over deze distilleerderij. The English. Van
St. George.
Van St. George, inderdaad. We hebben het gehad over Norfolk. Yes. Over alles wat daar te doen is aan slakkenraces. Mensen die daar geboren zijn. En over het vakantiehuis van de Queen. Waar je haar niet in haar pyjama aan een scone kunt zien zitten, helaas. We hebben het gehad over verschillende regels. Die in Engeland minder streng zijn dan in andere landen.
We hebben het met David gehad over het maken van whisky. Ja. Over hoe hij zijn best doet om andere esters en andere smaken te krijgen. Hoe belangrijk hout voor hun is. En we hebben het met Andrew gehad over de toekomst. En de legacy van de St. George's Distillery.
Ja.
Hey, nou, wij gaan trouwens ons uiterste best doen voor jullie. Om die nieuwe sherry cask te krijgen. Dus, dames en heren, wat we willen vragen is, maak een foto. Maak een selfie van jou met een buisje. Ja, begin.
Ik?
Doe dan.
Ja.
Maar iedereen thuis ook. Maak een foto van het buisje en laat zien van... Hé, luister, ik wil graag deze whisky, de sherry cask, thuis in mijn podcast abonnementje hebben. Dan gaan wij ons best doen. Stuur hem in via... Ja, die is leuk.
Leuk toch?
Stuur hem
Die
in.
komt op de Instagram.
Ik wou zeggen, stuur hem door naar onze Instagram, @elementsofwhisky. Of via Facebook, @elementsofwhisky. Nou, en stel je wilt dat podcastabonnement. Dus ja, hoe krijg je die dan thuis?
Dan ga je naar www.elementsofwhisky.nl/podcast.
Ja.
En daar vul je je gegevens in. En
meld je aan.
En
dan krijg
voor
je
het abonnement.
Elke 6 weken zo'n buisje thuis. Nou,
met daarin hopelijk binnenkort die mooie fles van St. George.
Ik ben heel benieuwd. Nou, dames en heren, ontzettend bedankt voor het luisteren. Wij zien jullie volgende week weer. Althans wij. Misschien ben ik er wel eens een keer niet. Ik ga op vakantie naar Norfolk. Ik vind het goed. Ik ga slakkenrace bekijken.
Ga je niet meedoen? Heb je geen getrainde slak?
Ik ga mijn best doen. Ik ga kijken of ik in het helemaal kan vinden.